If you were to go back to the countryside even now, it would suit you perfectly, you low-educated trash. And there she is, Mrs. White, the self-proclaimed famous college graduate and elite female department manager, laughing it off. She picked up the business card holder that had fallen from my pocket, casually pulled out a random business card, and carelessly tore it up, throwing it away. It's inhumane behavior. As if delivering the final blow, Mrs. White slammed the remaining business card holder onto the floor and stomped on it. The smiling faces of my wife and daughter, who had given me the gift, flashed through my mind. Overwhelmed by anger, I couldn't think of anything else. I'm Evan, a 58-year-old office worker. Originally, I worked at the headquarters of a company in the city, but 5 years ago, I was transferred to a factory in the countryside. When you hear that, it sounds like I did something wrong, but that's not the case. The company wanted me to oversee the site as one of the supervisors as they expanded their operations and increased the number of factories. It's great that you can go back to the main office. You've worked hard for 5 years. My wife smiles at me as she brings the food. I gulp down the rest of the beer in my glass, feeling embarrassed. When I received a special order to return to the main office, I was surprised. But since the approximate duration of the assignment had already been set, it was only expected. I had gotten used to working at the factory, and the 5-year term felt like it flew by. Now I have to prepare for the move, and next month I'll start working at the main office. Thank you. I've gotten so used to this job here that, ironically, I feel a bit nervous about going back. I was getting along well, and everyone at the factory too, and they treated me like a father figure. Dad, stand tall and confident. You don't want the young employees at the main office to underestimate you, right? My daughter, who had already become an adult and started working in the professional world, jokingly said, and poured beer into my empty glass. My wife and I will soon be moving to the city where my company is headquartered, but our daughter has taken a job in the local area, so we are going to be separated. She was eager to experience living on her own during this opportunity. I'm secretly sad to leave my daughter, but it's time for me to leave her too. I've got to brace myself. What's more, what's going on? I noticed my wife returning from the kitchen looking a bit fidgety, and I tilted my head in curiosity. My daughter said, "Hey," and pulled at her mother's arm. What's going on, you two? Is something happening? As I inquired, my wife took out a small box that had been wrapped. This is a gift from me and Mom. Open it and see. I widened my eyes at my daughter's words. Was this some kind of surprise? I received it from my wife's hands and unwrapped the packaging, revealing a leather business card holder. Even I recognized it as a product from a famous overseas brand. You, all this. Seeing me frozen in surprise and joy, my wife and daughter exchanged amused giggles. We thought that once you return to the headquarters, you'll have more opportunities to hand out business cards. Thinking that she prepared it together with our daughter's help, my eyes welled up with warmth. It's okay to cry, Dad, you know. I turned my face away from her, saying, "Don't be silly," and surreptitiously wiped the corners of my eyes. But I'm really happy. Thank you. I'll cherish it, thinking of both of you. Upon hearing my words, both my wife and daughter nodded with smiles. With the move now complete, today marks the start of my work at the headquarters. I truly have come back. Last week I stopped by the department I was assigned to, greeted everyone in advance, but arriving at the office today, there is a certain deep emotion that wells up. I stepped into the office of the department I was assigned to. Since it's my first day, I made sure to arrive a little early, but there are already a few employees who have arrived at the office. I learned during my greetings that this time of year sees many people like me either returning to or being transferred to the headquarters. It must be that kind of season. As I looked around, I made eye contact with the employee I greeted last week. "Good morning." I returned the greeting, and as we were talking, suddenly from behind, "Hey, you're in the way!" A loud voice struck my eardrums. Startled, I turned around to find a female employee standing there. It seemed like she was around the same age as me, in her 50s perhaps, but her makeup and hairstyle were perfectly done, and there was a faint scent of perfume that gave off a slightly discordant impression. The moment I looked at her face, the employees around me quickly moved away. The departing employees appeared pale, and I tilted my head in confusion. Moreover, this female employee was a face I hadn't seen during the greetings. A person came to mind, and I opened my mouth to speak. Could it be Mrs. White, the department manager? The woman, upon being asked, snorted. Well, what's it to you? Oh, I wonder if there is a guy who is going to be transferred to our department. It's a real hassle this time of year with all the people coming in and out. I've been a working professional for a long time, but it might be the first time I've been called you so rudely by someone I just met. It seems like she doesn't even know who I am to begin with. Can it be possible that someone like a department manager is unaware of the employees coming in through transfers? I let out a sigh to myself. Why are you so nervous? You seem like the type of old man who can't handle the job. Although she appeared to be around the same age as me, I swallowed my words in response. I tried to greet her calmly, giving a slight nod. I came to greet this department last week, but I was told that you, the section chief, was on vacation and couldn't meet. I have been assigned here. While I was in the middle of speaking, Mrs. White shouted and cut me off. I was still talking, and frankly, I wasn't interested in your self-introduction. Her loud voice made the nearby desk employees tremble involuntarily. Mrs. White, even though it's still before work hours, it's not appropriate to speak so loudly. Everyone is startled. As I gently mentioned this, Mrs. White glared at me. May I? I am, an elite graduate of a very prestigious university. That's why I am recognized for my work and hold the position of the section chief in this department. Don't you dare think that someone like you who looks uneducated and incompetent can casually give me, your superior, any kind of admonition. She spoke so freely without knowing anything about me. According to my wife, my face apparently reflects my kind-hearted nature. Mrs. White, based solely on my face and demeanor, feels entitled to speak however she wants. I believe that people who exhibit such arrogant behavior towards those they perceive as beneath them behave entirely different when dealing with superiors. Otherwise, there's no way someone above her would allow her to remain as a department manager. So, what does your high education and your arrogant attitude have to do with anything? Even if you're smart, you don't seem to be aware of your own issues, are you? I calmly replied with a serious expression, causing someone in the office to burst out laughing. Mrs. White glared at me, her face turning red. You're so cocky, she said while forcefully pushing my shoulder. What are you doing? Caught off guard, I lost my balance. At that moment, something fell to the ground. It was the business card holder that my wife and daughter had gifted me. I'm sure I securely placed it in the inner pocket of my suit. Mrs. White picked up the business card holder and contemptuously tossed it aside. For an unimpressive old man like you, you don't even have a super high-end brand business card holder. How presumptuous of you to expect something like that. As she said that, she smirked, twisting her mouth. It's like giving pearls to a pig. You won't even have many opportunities to use business cards. How about going back to the countryside now? After all, the countryside is more suitable for low-educated trash like you. With those words, Mrs. White casually pulled out a business card, tore it haphazardly without even giving it a glance, and threw it away. Hey, please stop! I hurriedly tried to intervene, but it was too late. The surrounding employees watched in shock as Mrs. White's actions unfolded. As if delivering the final blow, Mrs. White slammed the business card holder into the floor and stomped on it. The smiles of my wife and daughter, who gave it to me as a present, flashed through my mind. Overwhelmed with anger, I couldn't think of anything. Amidst my shock and anger, I could hear whispers, hushed voices, reaching my ears. No one's stopping her, huh? Or, shh, if she hears, you'll end up
the same."
I could hear comments like these. In this short period of time, I felt like I grasped what kind of person Mrs. White, the department manager, was. She seemed to be playing the role of a self-proclaimed queen bee in this department, using her power to overpower her subordinates, ensuring no one would dare to oppose her. That's why, when she entered the room, the other employees fled, and even now, they are unable to intervene to stop Mrs. White's rampage. To contain my anger, I furrowed my brow. It's a habit I have when my emotions become overwhelming. Observing this gesture, Mrs. White must have misunderstood, thinking that I was on the verge of tears.
"Look at this old man acting his age."
She pointed her finger at me and laughed. Unable to bear witnessing it any longer, some of the employees left the office. "This is going too far, Mrs. White." Summoning up courage, a male employee squeezed himself between me and Mrs. White. He was one of the employees who showed concern for me when I came to greet everyone last week, filling in for the absent department manager.
"Huh? Who do you think you're talking to?"
Mrs. White retorted, but she seemed slightly shaken by the cold gaze of the male employee and the other employees. It's possible that Mrs. White was surprised to sense a rebellious spirit from the typically obedient employees.
"What? How much? It's probably one of the cheaper ones among high-end brand anyway. Just compensate for it, right?"
She made a statement as if suggesting compensation, but I shook my head. Even if you were to compensate for the same product, it wouldn't make a difference. The business card holder chosen by my wife and daughter is the only one of its kind. Upon hearing my words and realizing that the business card holder was a gift for my wife and daughter, the surrounding atmosphere grew more unsettled. At that moment, a familiar voice echoed from the office entrance. "Is the commotion happening in this office?" Both I and the other employees, along with Mrs. White, turned our gazes toward the entrance. Mrs. White let out a sound close to a scream.
Mr. Marcus!"
Standing there was the CEO. The employees who had left earlier were also present. Could it be that they went to the CEO's office? I remained silent and nodded to the CEO. The CEO approached. "Well, Evan, long time no see." Ignoring Mrs. White, the company president addressed me. "Mr. Marcus, it's been a while. Regarding this matter..." No need to be so formal. We're among our own, aren't we? Thank you for your hard work over the past 5 years. I apologize for not being able to greet you properly last week." Mrs. White stared blankly as the CEO and I exchanged words. To tell you the truth, the CEO and I have known each other since we worked together at this headquarters a long time ago. When the CEO was still an employee going through training, we naturally became close friends, because we were close in age and worked in the same department. While we drifted apart due to our respective positions after he became the CEO, we made it a point to meet up for drinks occasionally, maintaining our friendship. He trusted me, not just as the CEO, but as a friend. That's why I believe he entrusted me with one of the tasks related to the new business. By the way, Mrs. White had mistakenly assumed I was a perpetually low-ranking employee, but at that time I held a separate position in a different department. "Nevertheless, Mrs. White, until I heard it from your subordinates, I found it hard to believe. You went all out." Looking at the shredded remains of business cards scattered on the floor, the CEO, with a cold gaze, fixed his eyes on Mrs. White. Mrs. White's expression lost all composure, her eyes darting, and her lips trembling.
But, this newcomer made a disrespectful remark. I thought someone like him didn't need a business card, so I...
She stammered as she tried to defend herself, but her words lacked conviction. "Even if I assume your claims are true, do you think such arrogance is acceptable? Evan here is the new department manager of this division, and he is your superior. Besides, it was you who discarded the business cards, wasn't it?" Mrs. White's expression froze at the CEO's statement.
"He is my new boss and I discarded the business cards?"
She seemed confused and unable to comprehend the situation. The CEO took out a voice recorder from his pocket and pressed a button. The recording of her numerous outbursts played back, and Mrs. White's face turned pale. "This audio was provided by one of your subordinates. In addition to this, I had received evidence of your harassment from other employees. I was quietly taking action to ensure appropriate measures for you when Evan returned. When we hired you, you were a motivated and talented employee, but it's disappointing to see how things have turned out." Knowing about the actions taken by her subordinates behind the scenes, Mrs. White glared at those around her. However, now that the CEO had appeared, no one could look away from her. Mrs. White continued with meaningless excuses.
But I have contributed to this company all this time. Just because I had a slightly tough approach towards my subordinate. And it's your fault. You didn't properly inform me about this. The new manager's situation." Her criticism shifted towards the male employee who had defended me earlier. I did inform you, Mrs. White. But you were busy painting your nails and just gave a vague response, didn't you?" I stepped forward, defending the male employee. He has nothing to do with this. If you were doing your job properly as a department manager, you should have recognized me immediately. Moreover, even though today was the first time I met you, everyone seemed tense and nervous, judging by their facial expressions. Even in this short amount of time, I could tell that the work environment here is not normal. And because you were accustomed to such an environment, you had the audacity to tear up my business card and trample on my precious card holder. Right? The other employees also agreed with my statement. "That's right. You also shower us with abuse all the time. Some people couldn't bear it and ended up quitting."
The president nodded heavily, as if taking it seriously. "Today was actually the day I was going to present Evan's relocation to you, Mrs. White, but if only I had prepared you before Evan arrived. We really need to take measures to pay closer attention to the details. To everyone in the department, Evan, I'm truly sorry for my shortcomings." Mrs. White, who had become truly isolated and unsupported, either out of seeking sympathy or as a way to divert the conversation, began talking about her personal life.
"I've been actively seeking a partner and working on self-improvement, but I haven't seen any results, and it has been weighing on my heart. And I'm almost turning 50. She went on to say things like, "All my colleagues from the same group got married, and I was the only one left alone without any peace of mind." It was truly a self-centered perspective, and during that time she never offered any apologies to those around her. While Mrs. White does seem to pay attention to her appearance, such as hairstyles, makeup, and nails, I wonder if she may have mistaken enhancing her external appearance for self-improvement? Of course, I have no intention of denying the importance of personal grooming. However, I don't believe that someone who generally focuses on self-improvement would hurl abusive words at others or behave arrogantly as she did. It's likely that these kinds of distortions gradually shaped her into the person she is today. Even if someone was excellent in the past, it's meaningless if they forget to consider the feelings of others. Having a good educational background and being talented, but lacking basic human decency, can only have a negative impact on the people around them. So, does that mean it's okay to lash out at those around you? Everyone is dealing with something in their lives. Your remarks leave no room for sympathy. They're just mere excuses. As I tried to advise her, Mrs. White desperately shouted back. "I'll study. I'll make amends and apologize to everyone. Not really that kind of person. Please, give me a chance."
Why don't you just come to terms with the fact that it's not about that anymore? She bowed her head in defeat and covered her face, realizing her complete defeat. Afterwards, as the CEO had mentioned, Mrs. White received disciplinary treatment. She was demoted to a regular employee and apparently ordered to transfer to a rural area similar to where I was, but due to her pride, she refused the transfer and resigned. After that,
"I said that finding another job is ridiculous. I'll prove it by snagging a young, handsome, highly educated man who will make me a full-time housewife.
She reportedly spent a large sum of money to register with a high-end marriage agency and actively engaged in matchmaking activities. The results were disastrous, and her pride was completely shattered. As for how I know about this story, it's because I overheard the female employees gossiping about it. Apparently, an employee somewhere had to listen to her complaints about the high costs of matchmaking activities and ended up spreading those complaints as gossip to other colleagues. No matter how high your academic background is, it is meaningless if you do not continue to improve your inner self after joining a company. Otherwise, your heart will become distorted and clouded, just like dirty laundry. She should have realized sooner the importance the company places on teamwork. My name is Evan. I look forward to working with you today. I love that business card case my wife and daughter gave me, and I am dedicated to my work.